Hi there. In this tutorial video, I want to show you how to connect the Thunkable app with an online database using the web API of Thunkable X. In our case, I'm using QuintaDB, which is an online database that I found searching on Google, and which is a really fine tool. So before I introduce you to QuintaDB, let's have an overview of the steps of this tutorial. First of all, there's an introduction where I can show you QuintaDB and what this tool is all about. I will define a task. Then we are going to QuintaDB to build our database. In step 4 and 5, we are building the frontend and the functions using Thunkable X. And of course, in the last step, I will show you a live demonstration of the app and the connection. So let's have a look at QuintaDB. As mentioned before, I searched for an online database using Google and found QuintaDB.com, and I really fell in love with it because it's a full-fledged database, and one thing that is really convincing is the pricing, because you can register for free and you get 5 forms, which means 5 tables, 1,000 records, and you can upload up to 500 of megabyte of files. And I think this is enough to build small apps, or at least to build a testing environment so you can scale up your system at a later point. The pricing is very convincing and it's fine, and you have enough steps to scale and to upgrade your system. There's a second thing. I run into problems developing this connection, and I couldn't get on using the documentation of QuintaDB or the documentation of the API. So I contacted the support of QuintaDB and got an answer within a few hours, and it was very competent and helpful. They showed me a function that I will show you in this video that is really unique and is not in the documentation. And this was the solution. So this is a really fine support, and feel free to get registered and to use not only this tool but also the support. You will find a link to QuintaDB in the show notes just beneath this video. So let's have a look on the task. We want to build an app that has a simple form where a user can type in his name and the password and transmit this to the server. But that's only the first step. In the second step, we want to manage to read this specific information from this user, let's call it a record, and show it in the app. And we want to give the user the possibility to alter the password and to transmit this information to the server so that the record will be updated. So at this point you might ask, why not using another method that seems more simple than using a database, that is Airtable. Airtable is included in Thunkable, and as you probably know, there is a module called Spreadsheet, and in fact Spreadsheet is a component that connects your Thunkable app with Airtable. And Airtable is an online spreadsheet system. Well, I run into problems using Airtable for my specific task. That is that you will find a few tutorials and videos showing you how to collect data in your app, transmit it to Airtable, and to generate new records in this table. But if I want to read a specific row in this table, which means record, or I want to update a specific record, which means row in this table, then I do have problems using Airtable. Well, let me tell you that I work with Thunkable now for about 2 months, so I'm no expert at all. And there might be solutions, so please feel free to tell me how you would solve this problem using Airtable. But I'm pretty used to using real databases where I can address a simple record and to work with this record and to update this record. So this is the reason I'm not using Airtable for this task. Well, before we start programming and building our app, I want to give you a little insight in the JSON protocol, because knowledge about JSON is or could be very essential working with the web API in Thunkable. Well, as you can see, we do have our mobile device and our app, and we do have the online database, and we want to send data and receive data from this database. And this is done using the JSON protocol. Well, the JSON protocol is a very distinct text file, let's say string, that has a very distinct format. And as you can see on this slide, we are using in a very specific kind of format, using brackets and well, this kind of system. You can build up JSON files as you like, but if you are using a specific API like the QuintaDB, you have to follow the guidelines of this API. What might be essential is that this JSON format is very similar to the objects system of Thunkable X. So what you can see here in form of a JSON string can be built up using objects in Thunkable X. And maybe you want to think this through, and you will understand how these two formats and systems work together. But that is the reason why you can transform JSON to object and object to JSON within the Thunkable X framework. So let's build up our table in our database. And as you can see, I started a new project in QuintaDB. A project is a database, and the database holds the tables. So I started also to include a new form, which means table. And at this point, I'm starting to define the columns, which means the fields. So the first field should have the title name and is a single line. And I want to include a second column that is called password and is also a single line. So if you have a look here, my table just consists of these two columns. When clicking on records, you will see I have no data in this table up to now. So just to have some data, I will write in the name Sam and the password whatever, and we have our first record. Let's build a second record just to see how this looks like. We have Joe, and he has a very simple password. So we have a second record. One thing that might be very useful at a later point is getting the API key that we have to include in our Thunkable app. So to get this key, go to your profile, to account. And if you scroll down, you get the link to for developers. This is a very handy page because here is the documentation for the API, and we will use this at a later point. But at the moment we need to generate an API key. So I click on API key, create API key, and I give them a name. Let's say Thunkable API. Create, and this is the one you should use. So you should generate your own API, of course, because I will delete this specific database after creating this video. So this won't work for you. But feel free to register on QuintaDB and generate your own API key. So let's start building our app in Thunkable X. The first thing you want to do is to include the component for the web API. Just drag and drop it to your app and give it a name like QuintaDB. Set the URL to https://quintadb.com and set the right property to include the API key, and that is REST API key, and just paste the API key that was generated on QuintaDB. So you're ready and fine to build up the app now and to establish the connection. Now for building up my front end, I will build 3 screens and all the components, and I will fast forward this video so not to annoy you. So we are ready with the front end, so let's get coding. I prepared two things. The first one is I initialize a variable called record ID and I store it in the device. I will show you later on the reason why. And the second thing is I start to build a coding around this button, which will send the information that is gathered in the input fields to the database. So let's have a look in the documentation of QuintaDB. And if you look here, there is a documentation for creating a record. This is exactly what we need. And if I click here, I see that the call looks like apps/appid/dtypes.json. Well, the problem at this point is that to establish this call, we need an app ID. And the app ID is a very unique identifier for our database. So the first step is to get this app ID. Well, back to the documentation, we see in the sector database, get all databases, that there is a call where we get a list of all databases. And the very interesting thing is that I can make this call in my browser, not only in the Thunkable app. That's because I still have an open session to QuintaDB, so my API key works, and I can send an URL call with my browser. So the call looks like apps.json. So I write apps.json and I get a JSON file. It looks like a list of my databases, but I don't have only one database. So there is a database with the ID. It has a name DemoDB that I've just created for this project. And this ID is the unique identifier for the database. So I copy this one and save it for the further steps. Well, now comes the really difficult part, but it's very similar to the first step. So to include the information that we have, the data that we have in the fields, and to transport this data to the database and to write it to the right positions, we need to know identifiers for the fields. We can't simply name a position like name or password, but each of the columns in our table has a similar identifier as the database. So how do we get this information? Well, the first one is, let's go to the documentation. And as I told you, a table is called form in our QuintaDB. So what we have to do is we have to find the identifier for our table, that means our form. And there is a function fetch all database forms. This looks like this, where the ID is the unique identifier for the database. I've prepared this function for you, and you can see here it's QuintaDB/apps, the identifier for the database, entities.json. And we see we do have only one table that has this identifier, right? So I copy this one, go back to my documentation, and now I take a function that is called fetch all records. And this looks like apps/identifier of the database/dtypes/entity/ the entity ID that I just copied .json, and hopefully this will provide the identifiers, the unique IDs for our fields. So I go to this browser and type dtypes entity/ the identifier of the form .json. And when I call this, I get a JSON with all the records in my table that has the identifier that I found. Well, and if you have a close look, you will see there are IDs, column, and there are some datas that I just included in QuintaDB in the first step. So this looks like a password. So the identifier for the column password looks like this. And I will copy this for the next steps. If I look here, there is Sam. And the unique identifier for this column looks like this. And it's the same identifier as I have to find another, as you see with Joe. So the whole column has the same identifier, and that's okay. So these two identifiers are really necessary for the next steps. So now we are ready to build our blog to transmit the data and to generate this new record in the database. This might sound a little bit complicated, but follow my words, it's not that complicated. So let's have a look at the create record documentation. You see, this is the call apps / the unique identifier of the database / dtypes.json. It's a post call. And this is the parameter list in JSON format. Have a closer look. In these values, we have the entity ID. This is the unique ID of the form that we just got in the former process. There is an ID to transmit. This is a unique ID that you can give to the newly generated record. And after this, we will transmit the fields. So we have two fields, and we will transmit a unique identifier for the first field and the content, and the second field and the second content. Let's have a look especially on this ID, because this is new. You have to generate a 22-character long URL-safe base64 identifier. So we have to generate this ID, and the database does not make this or generate this automatically. Let's go back to Thunkable. This is the call. First three lines are the call, QuintaDB /apps. This is the identifier of the database / dtypes.json. Now here is the magic. To transmit values and parameters to this call, to the database, we have to use a question mark, JSON _ values equals, and after this a JSON formatted parameter list, just like in the documentation. This information here is not in the documentation from QuintaDB. This was told by the support. So once again, use question mark JSON _ values equals. After this, entity ID, and give the ID number from the form. Now we are on to generate our unique record ID. So I do ID. Well, our record ID has to have 22 characters. And what I do to get a unique ID, I take the seconds since 1970. Because this value is in milliseconds, I multiply with 1000, and I get a value that is 13 characters long. So to get a unique identifier that is 22 characters long, I add this one to 9 characters that I put in front. After this, I have my two fields. This is the unique identifier that was fetched in the former step. It's the identifier of the column name. And after this, I put in the data from my input field. After this is the parameter, the identifier from my column password. And after this is the content of my input field. And at the end, I conclude this string. So think this through, analyze this structure, and you get the whole call for your QuintaDB generate new record call. After this, I set my in QuintaDB call post command. And what I did here is I have a field message that is put just beneath the register button. And in this message, I will show the response of this call. So I will show this programming now in the live demonstration. So if we look in our QuintaDB database, we see the newly generated record and the information we just sent from our app, and hey, success! If we go to Thunkable, I've added two things. The first one is this line. In this line, I take the response that we just saw in our app, convert it to an object, and from this object I go into record and fetch the ID. So this is the same ID that was generated when preparing the transmitting parameters. And I store this ID in record ID. I do this because when starting the app the next time, I don't want the user to have to register once again, but I want to the app to jump to the profile page and only to register when the record ID is not filled. So after registration, I navigate to profile. And that's the end of the registration process. So let's go on with the profile page. And if you got through the registration, then trust me, the profile is really easy. Reading data is really easy. So first a look in the documentation. If we have a look in get records, then we see that the call is like /apps/ the ID of the database /dtypes/ ID JSON, so the ID of the record. We don't have any parameters to transmit to the server, but we get a response that includes all our data and our fields. So back to our block. This is a new block that I included, and this is executed whenever the profile page opens. So you see the call like in the documentation, quintadb.com/apps/. This is the ID of our database /dtypes/ and now I use the record ID that I stored in this variable in the first place, .json. This is exactly the call like in the documentation, like you see here. So we get a response, and this response is our record data. And from this record data, from this response, I convert the response to an object. I go into record of this object, into values, And in these values, I have my identifier for the name field. So I get the property of the name field and put this one to the txt name label in our front end. This is this one. And I do exactly the same with the password. Like here, response, get object from JSON, convert it, look into record, into values, into the identifier of the password field, and put the property of this field in the txt password. This is this label. So and now up to the last step, updating a password. So we are on the screen, set new password. You know, this looks like this one. When looking into the blocks, we need two blocks. The first one, let me collapse this one and expand this one. The first one loads the information like we did on the profile page. So this is the call as we know it, and we put the name in the label name, and we put the password in the input field password, so that we get the right informations. So this is nothing new compared to profile. I will collapse this one and expand a second one. The second one is activated whenever the button set new password on this page when the save is clicked. So let's have a look on this block. Having a look at the documentation, we see that updating a record looks like apps, the app ID of the database /dtypes / the ID of the record.json. And to submit a new password, we have to include in values the field identity and the new password. So this looks like this. This is the call, QuintaDB /apps, the ID of the database /dtypes / the record ID that we want to alter, .json, then $JSON _values equals, and now the identifier for the password and the new password that we have in the field input new password. And that's all. Just to show that this is working, we navigate to the page profile, and after this is executed, we should see in our app the new password shown in profile. So in fact, that's all you have to do, and I will show you the whole process now in my mobile device. I hope you had fun looking at this video, this tutorial, and is helpful to you. Let me know in the comments which apps you are building and if QuintaDB is the right solution for you. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate and contact me using the comments. So thank you very much, and maybe up till the next tutorial. See you!